Next stop, the top. That is what you must declare over your life. That is the mindset you must carry. But here's the shocking truth. Most people never get there. They stay stuck at the bottom, trapped in fear, doubt, and the opinions of others. They walk in circles, complaining about their circumstances, never realizing that God has already given them the power to rise. The Israelites stood at the edge of the promised land, but fear paralyzed them. They saw giants instead of God's promise. They saw obstacles instead of opportunity, and because of that, an entire generation wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, not because God didn't want to bless them, but because they didn't believe they could reach the top. How many people today are living in that same cycle, going around the same problems, fighting the same battles, doubting the same promises? The enemy doesn't have to destroy you. All he has to do is convince you that you're not worthy of the next level. He whispers lies. You're not good enough. You don't have what it takes. Stay where you are. But if you listen to those lies, you'll never take the step forward. You'll never claim what God has already placed in front of you. The next stop is the top, but only for those who refuse to stay at the bottom. Look at Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned. Everything in his life screamed failure. But what did he do? He didn't settle. He didn't let bitterness consume him. He didn't give up on God's vision. Even in prison, he remained faithful. And because of that, one day, in a single moment, God lifted him from the prison to the palace. Your situation might look impossible. You might feel like you've been thrown into a pit, betrayed, abandoned. But do you have the endurance to hold on to God's promise? Do you have the faith to declare, next stop, the top, even when everything around you says otherwise? Some people will try to hold you back. Some will mock your faith. They did it to Noah. They laughed at him while he built the ark, calling him crazy. But when the rain came, it was Noah who was prepared, Noah who was saved, because he listened to God instead of the crowd. If you want to rise, you must be willing to separate yourself. You must silence the voices that tell you to stay comfortable. You must step out in faith, even when you don't see the whole picture. Peter walked on water, but only because he had the courage to step out of the boat. The moment he doubted, he began to sink. If you focus on the storm, you'll sink. But if you fix your eyes on God, you will rise. This journey to the top isn't for the weak. It's for the warriors, the faithful, the ones who refuse to quit. It's for those who say, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. It's for those who are willing to wrestle like Jacob, refusing to let go until they receive their blessing. The next stop is the top, not because of your strength, but because of God's power, not because of your perfection, but because of his grace. The question is, will you take the step? Will you trust him when it doesn't make sense? Will you keep pressing forward when the world tells you to quit? If you keep your eyes on him, if you stay faithful, if you refuse to let fear hold you back, then get ready, because the top is your next destination. And when God lifts you up, no man, no devil, no force in hell can bring you down. The reason so many never reach the top is not because they lack the talent, the opportunity, or the resources. It is because fear and doubt have imprisoned them. They stand at the edge of their breakthrough, at the doorstep of God's promises, yet they hesitate. They see the obstacles, the giants in the land, and instead of believing in what God has spoken, they believe in what their eyes can see. The Israelites were proof of this. God had already given them the promised land. It was theirs. Yet when they saw the opposition, they shrank back in fear 12 spies went into the land, but only 2, Joshua and Caleb, believed they could take it. The others came back with a fearful report saying, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. And because of their fear, an entire generation wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, not because God failed them, but because they failed to believe. How many today are living in that same cycle? God has placed a calling on their life. He has prepared a path for them, but they hesitate. They let fear whisper that they are not capable, that the journey is too hard, that the opposition is too great. They hear the enemy say, you're not strong enough, you're not qualified, you'll fail just like before. And instead of stepping forward, they turn back. But here is the truth. Fear is a liar. It is an illusion created by the enemy to keep you from the life God has already destined for you. The giants in the land may be big, but your God is bigger. The obstacles in front of you may seem impossible, but nothing is impossible with God. The only thing standing between you and the top is your willingness to trust Him. Joshua and Caleb saw the same giants, the same walled cities, the same challenges, but they had a different spirit. They believed in God's power more than the size of their enemies, and because of that, they entered the land when others perished in the wilderness. Do not let fear steal what God has already given you. Do not let doubt rob you of your destiny. If God has called you to it, He will bring you through it. But you must take the step. You must believe. You must declare, next stop, the top, and move forward in faith. The enemy doesn't always come with thunder and fire. He doesn't always attack with visible destruction. Sometimes his greatest weapon is simply a whisper, just enough to plant doubt, just enough to make you question yourself, just enough to convince you to stay exactly where you are. He doesn't need to chain you up when he can get you to chain yourself with fear, insecurity, and hesitation. This is how he has worked since the beginning. When the serpent approached Eve in the Garden of Eden, he didn't force her to sin. He simply questioned what God had said. Did God really say? That's all it took, a single seed of doubt, a single moment of uncertainty. And the moment she entertained the thought, the enemy had already won. The same thing happens today. The devil whispers, you're not good enough, you're not strong enough, you're not worthy of the next level. And the moment you agree, you stay stuck. God calls you higher, but you hesitate. He opens doors, but you're too afraid to walk through them. You tell yourself, maybe I'm not ready, maybe I should wait, maybe I'll fail. And so you remain exactly where the enemy wants you, paralyzed, stagnant, afraid to move forward. Look at the man who sat by the pool of Bethesda for 38 years. Jesus asked him, do you want to be healed? And instead of saying yes, he started making excuses. He said, I have no one to help me. He had accepted his condition as permanent. He had spent so long in his suffering that he had stopped believing that change was possible. But Jesus didn't entertain his excuses. He simply told him, get up, take your mat, and walk. So silence the voice of doubt. Reject the enemy's lies. If God has called you, He has already equipped you. The next stop is the top, but you have to believe it. You have to take the step. You have to move in faith. Because when God lifts you up, no force in hell can hold you down. Joseph's life is proof that no betrayal, no hardship, no injustice can stop the plan of God. He was chosen, favored, and anointed, but his journey to the top was filled with suffering. His own brothers hated him. They stripped him of his robe, threw him into a pit, and sold him into slavery. He went from being his father's beloved son to being a servant in a foreign land. Most people would have given up. Most would have looked at their situation and said, God has forgotten me. But Joseph refused to let his pain define his faith. Even in Potiphar's house as a slave, he remained faithful. He served with integrity, and because of that, he found favor. But just when things seemed to be getting better, another test came. He was falsely accused and thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. At this point, many would have questioned God. Why is this happening to me? Why am I suffering when I have done nothing wrong? But Joseph didn't complain. He didn't allow bitterness to take root. Even in prison, he remained faithful. He interpreted dreams, he served others, and he trusted that God was still with him. And then, in a single moment, everything changed. One day he was in a prison cell. The next he was standing before Pharaoh. And in that moment, God lifted him from the lowest place to the highest. He went from being a forgotten prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. Not because of luck, not because of talent alone, but because of his faithfulness in the struggle. This is what so many people miss. They want elevation without endurance. They want the blessing without the test. But God is watching how you handle the prison before he brings you to the palace. Can you stay faithful when no one sees? Can you keep trusting when everything looks like it's falling apart? Joseph's story is proof that delay is not denial. Just because you are struggling now doesn't mean God has forgotten you. Just because you are in the pit today doesn't mean you won't be in the palace tomorrow. The enemy wants you to give up in the struggle, but God is asking you to remain faithful, because when the time is right, he will elevate you and nothing will be able to stop it. Not everyone can go where God is taking you. If you want to reach the top, you must be willing to separate yourself from the crowd. You must be willing to walk alone if necessary, because the path to elevation is not crowded. It is narrow, and few are willing to take it. Noah understood this. God gave him an assignment to build an ark when there was no rain, to prepare for a flood when the world had never seen one. And while he obeyed, the people mocked him. They laughed at his faith, ridiculed his obedience, and called him a fool. But Noah didn't stop. He didn't argue. He didn't try to fit in with the crowd. He just kept building. And when the rain finally came, those who mocked him were the ones left outside. But Noah and his family were safe because he chose to separate himself from a sinful world and follow God. The same is true today. When God calls you higher, he often calls you to separate. There are relationships that cannot go with you. There are friendships that will hold you back. There are environments that will kill your faith. If you try to fit in with everyone, you will miss what God has for you. If you listen to the voices of the world, you will stay stuck in mediocrity. Look at Abraham. God told him to leave his father's house, to step away from everything familiar and go to a land he would show him. God didn't even tell him exactly where. He just said, go. And Abraham obeyed. He walked by faith, not by sight. And because of his obedience, he became the father of many nations. But it required separation. He had to leave behind his past to step into his future. Some people are too attached to their surroundings to receive what God has for them. They are holding on to people, places, and habits that God has already told them to release. But you cannot elevate while clinging to what is holding you down. You must be willing to step out, to walk alone if necessary, to trust that when you follow God, he will never leave you stranded. Separation is not rejection, it is preparation. God removes distractions so you can focus. He isolates you so he can elevate you. So do not be afraid to walk away from what is keeping you from the top, because if you listen to the world, you'll stay stuck. But if you listen to God, you'll rise. The difference between those who stay where they are and those who rise is one thing: faith. Not faith in themselves, not faith in their own strength, but faith in the power of God. Faith is not about waiting for perfect conditions. It is about stepping out, even when everything around you says it's impossible. Peter understood this, but only for a moment. When he saw Jesus walking on water, he had the boldness to say, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And when Jesus said, "Come," Peter stepped out. He did what no other disciple dared to do. While the rest stayed in the boat, Peter moved toward Jesus. And as long as his eyes were fixed on the Lord, he did the impossible. He walked on water. But then the wind blew, the waves crashed, the storm raged around him. And in that moment, he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the storm. And the second he did, he began to sink. Fear replaced faith, doubt overtook confidence, and he started drowning in the very thing he had just been walking on. This is the reality for so many people today. They start strong, they step out in faith, believing that God will lead them higher, but then the storm comes, trouble hits, people criticize, things don't go as planned, and instead of keeping their focus on God, they focus on the problem. And just like Peter, they start sinking, not because God has failed them, but because they stopped trusting Him. Faith is the only way to the next level. You cannot wait until the storm stops. You cannot wait until conditions are perfect. If you want to rise, you must step out while the wind is still blowing. You must trust God when you don't see the whole picture. You must believe that if He called you, He will sustain you. The other disciples stayed in the boat. They stayed where it was safe. But Peter experienced something they never did. He walked on water. Yes, he stumbled, but Jesus reached out and pulled him up. And that's the beauty of faith. Even when you fall, God will lift you up. The next stop is the top, but you will never get there if you refuse to step out. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Don't focus on the storm. Don't focus on the obstacles. If God has called you, move. Because as long as you trust Him, you will rise. Reaching the top is not about your strength, your intelligence, or your connections. It is about God's power working in your life. Too many people try to climb higher in their own ability, striving, pushing, and exhausting themselves, only to find that their strength isn't enough. But the truth is, when God is the one lifting you up, nothing and no one can stop it. Look at David. He was just a shepherd boy, forgotten by his own family. When the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next king, David wasn't even invited to the gathering. His father only saw him as a boy who tended sheep, not as a future ruler. But God saw differently. While others looked at outward appearance, God looked at the heart. And in a moment, David went from being overlooked to being anointed as king, not because of his strength, not because of his background, but because of God's power. And even after being anointed, David didn't force his way to the throne. He didn't try to manipulate his way to the top. He trusted God's timing. He had to go through battles, rejection, and years of waiting, but no matter what the enemy threw at him, his elevation was unstoppable. King Saul tried to kill him. His enemies tried to destroy him. But when God's hand is on you, no attack can prevent what He has planned. So many people get discouraged because they think they have to do it all themselves. They think success depends on their talent, their wisdom, or their effort. But the Bible says, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. If God is for you, who can be against you? The enemy wants you to believe that you're not strong enough. And the truth is, you're not. But God is, and His power is what will take you where you could never go on your own. When the time is right, God will elevate you. He will open doors no man can shut. He will prepare a table for you in the presence of your enemies. And when He lifts you up, no force in hell, no opposition, no attack can bring you down. So stop worrying about how you'll get there. Stop striving in your own strength. Trust in God's power. Stay faithful, stay obedient, and watch as He takes you higher than you ever imagined. The next stop is the top, and nothing can stop it when God is the one leading the way.